All right, hey guys, welcome to our class today on amendments and terminations. As you see behind me, this is not a mock-up of the video. This is an actual room in the house. We got our Carolina Panthers gear and Mr. Luke Kuechly ready to tackle us. And I wanted to do the video from here today because it's NFL Draft Day. So some kind of sports is fantastic right now. So I wanted to do the video from this room today. So anyway, let's get into the amendments and terminations and see what we can do to walk through these forms today. Okay? So first things first, let's talk about the different kinds of terminations forms that we have working in residential real estate. There are four kinds of terminations that we have. We have the regular termination by mutual agreement, with release of earnest money and one without the release of earnest money. All right, and those are right here. Termination of contract by mutual agreement with release of earnest money, and then termination of contract by mutual agreement without the release of earnest money. All right, so we'll look at those in just a second. Then the other two forms that we have are the notice to the seller that buyer is exercising their right to terminate the contract, and notice to the buyer that the seller is exercising their right to terminate the contract. Okay, so let's get into those four kinds of terminations and why each one should be used. The quick version is if you're in a due diligence period or you're in a situation where the buyer or the seller needs to terminate immediately, that's when I would use the notice to the seller, notice to the buyer that we are terminating the contract. Okay. If it's something that we have a little bit of time left and we're still talking about things, that's when I would recommend we do the termination by mutual agreement. All right. But let's look at this one first. Most of the time, I'd want you to use this version, the 390-T, termination of contract by mutual agreement. And the reason why I want you to use this form is just simply because it's nicer. It's easier. Everybody's agreeing to what's happening here. There's no other questions of what's going on. So I highly recommend we use this whenever possible, unless we're in a time crunch again, all right? So basically to fill this one out, you put in your seller name, your buyer name, same as what was on the contract. Don't change them, exactly the way it was on the contract. I prefer you not fill in the mailing addresses. Okay, I still don't need the other clients knowing the addresses of whom the other party is. But let's say buyer's getting their earnest money back and we want to fill that in here. That's what the form is for. That's perfectly fine. I'm just still not a big believer in giving out the contact information for the other side. Okay, so we have those going on there. The property address, what property is this for, and what was the effective date of that contract. So the effective date was the final day it was signed, or the last person to sign it. What day was that? That's your effective date. All right, so put that date in there. Then we have the deposit, because remember, this is the termination by mutual agreement and release of the earnest money. All right, so the earnest money, if there was earnest money, it has to get released. It can't just sit there. It's got to get released one way or another. Okay, so typically, let's say there was $1,000 earnest money on this property. All right, how can that $1,000 be divvied up? It could be $1,000 to the buyer. It could be $1,000 to the seller. It could be $500 to the buyer, $500 to the buyer, $500 to the seller. It could be $1 to the buyer, $999 to the seller. Okay, so any combination is fine. It's just whatever they've agreed to. All right. So typically, you'd want it to say something like this, though. All right. Let's see, $1,000 returned to the buyer. I can spell $1,000 returned to the buyer, like that. Okay. That's typically what you're going to want it to read. Just don't have it read this. Don't have it say $1,000. What does that mean, right? $1,000 to whom? Who's getting it? Don't just say this. Return to buyer. I see that sometimes. Um, Everyone kind of knows what you mean, but you do have to make an assumption there, which is never a good idea. So make sure you have the actual amount. Who's getting what? Is it $1,000 to the buyer, 500 seller, 500 buyer? What's happening? Okay, it doesn't have to go to the buyer. If the seller thinks they should keep their earnest money, could be $1,000 to the seller. Okay, even if you're past due diligence, let's say you're past due diligence period. So by the contract, the buyer shouldn't get back their earnest money, right? Yeah, maybe. There's a lot of other terms of the contract. So maybe the seller feels like the buyer has violated those other terms, and the seller's like, hey, no, send us the termination, but we think we should get the earnest money. And the buyer says, I'll send them the termination, but I think I should get the earnest money. All right. If that's the case, just fill this out as $1,000 to the buyer. If you're the buyer agent, send it to them. If the seller doesn't like it, they don't have to sign this. Okay. And that's why we have the other forms, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right. But make sure you're saying where the deposit's going here. Okay. Next part here. If another amount or other consideration is being paid in connection with a termination of contract, such as amount consideration as follows, describe the consideration to be paid and payable. If none, put NA. So typically you're going to put NA in there. But what might that be? Well, sometimes it's that the buyer is going to give the seller the home inspection for $200. So the buyer's getting their earnest money back, but the buyer is willing to give the seller the home inspection, or anything involved. Maybe there's some repair issues that had been caused, and so the buyer is going to compensate the seller, or maybe the other way around. Okay, so if there's any of that other stuff, that would go there. Otherwise, it'd just be NA. All right, and then simply buyer and seller sign. If it's an entity, then they sign there. So that form is pretty easy. Okay, but like we were saying, what if they don't agree on the earnest money? Well, if they don't agree on the earnest money, they are agreeing to terminate, then we would sign 391-T. Pull this one up here. Here we go. 391-T, which is the termination of contract by mutual agreement without the release of earnest money. Well, why would we sign this? Because the buyer needs to move on to buy something else, and the seller needs to get their home back on the market. So we got to terminate the contract, otherwise we got a legal issue there. So we're terminating the contract, we'll figure out the earnest money later. Okay? So that's what this form is saying. So essentially it reads similar to the other 390, but we're terminating the contract. That's all terminated, but the deposit isn't listed here. Buyer and seller sign this. We're terminating the contract. Page 2 has the release. So we can sign page 1, terminating the contract, but then we always have page 2 sitting out here for the buyer and seller to come to an agreement, sign this, and move on. All right, so that's how that one works. If they don't agree, then we go down that path where whoever's holding the earnest money gives notice to the buyer and the seller, hey, I'm going to release this money to the clerk of court. The clerk of court accepts the money. There's a hearing, and the buyer and the seller have a chance to come before a magistrate and make their case, and whatever the law deems necessary is who's going to get that earnest money. Okay? So that's how we use this form, right? But sometimes, again, notice on those releases, on those terminations by mutual agreement, notice that on both of those, you need buyer and seller to sign them. So that's perfectly fine, except sometimes you're in a hurry. Like let's say let's say you've got a property that needs to, has a due diligence period that ends at 5 o'clock today. Well, it's too late to send them the mutual agreement. We need to just send them the notice, right? So we use this form 350-T. Notice to the seller that the buyer is exercising their right to terminate. So buyer name up there, seller name, property address, effective date of the contract, right? Pretty easy. Then we have these boxes. But notice we just have these boxes. We don't have any place to write anything else in. So it has to fit one of these criteria to use this form. If not, you got to go back to the mutual agreement thing, okay? So the non-receipt of the property disclosure statement, that's one reason. The right during the due diligence period from the buyer. That's the mostly used version of this, right? The property is not substantially in the same or better condition. Maybe something, maybe the house burned down. Maybe a car ran through it. We've seen all of that. So if something happened to the house, the buyer doesn't want to buy it anymore, there's a condition in the contract right here, paragraph 11, that states that the home needs to be in the same or better condition. So if that's not the case, then the buyer has the right to get out. All right. Seller's delay in settlement or closing beyond the permitted terms. So basically, 14 days ish past the contract date, then the buyer could terminate unilaterally. The exercise of the buyer to right to terminate under the backup contract addendum, or under the short sale addendum, or under the FHA VA addendum. All right, FHA VA financing addendum just says the home needs to appraise at the price, and if it doesn't, then the buyer has a right to back out. Okay, so this is unilateral. Only the buyer signs it. Big difference. Only the buyer signs it. So this is a unilateral. Hey, we're terminating. Nothing you can do about it. See ya. Right now, whether if the seller disagrees and says, "Well, that's not the case. Whatever you checked here," well, let the attorneys figure that one out. Okay. But otherwise, the buyer can just terminate. But we still have to remove the earnest money. We still have to give it back to the buyer or the seller. So that's why we have a page 2 where the seller signs this. And in this case, there is no seller getting the earnest money because the buyer has the right under all of these conditions to get their earnest money back. All right. So immediately, just the seller signs this and the money goes back to the buyer. Well, what if the seller doesn't agree to this? Well, we're back in that scenario where eventually, if buyer and seller can't come together, then they're going to go to the clerk of court and they're going to have their time to talk in front of a magistrate. All right. So that's the buyer termination or notice. The buyer's notice to the seller of their right to terminate. Basically, we have the exact same thing, but from the seller side. So we have the notice to the buyer that the seller is terminating. Okay. Let's take a look at this. Buyer name, seller name, property address, contract effective date. And here we only have 4 blocks. The buyer's failure to deliver the due diligence or earnest money, buyer's failure to timely deliver the additional earnest money, the buyer's delay in closing, and then the exercise by seller to right to terminate under paragraph 4 of the short sale addendum. That's it for the seller. These are their only 4 unilateral rights to be able to terminate. Okay, so same thing, only the seller signs the first page, then we still have to give back the earnest money. But in this case, on the seller one, they have both buyer and seller sign it, and it could go either way. All right, could go either way in these cases. So again, same thing. If they can't come to an agreement, then eventually the escrow agent will have to give it to the clerk of court. Okay, so pretty simple on the terminations. A couple amendment forms I want to go over. First of all, for our contracts, the number 1 amendment form that we use is the 4T. 4T goes in conjunction with 2T, and it simply gives you these options on how to amend the offer to purchase. If you notice on 4T, there are no blanks for you to just write whatever you want. You can only check off a box, okay? So if there's anything other than these items, you have to go back to the contract and either do a cross out, initial and date by everybody, or maybe you have to redo the whole contract perhaps. But on that note, before I misspeak on that, once you have an agreement on a 2T offer to purchase or 12T for land, do not go back and redo the whole contract because you still have a contract in play. So even though you want to change something now, don't go back and erase all the signatures and redo the whole thing because that creates some legal problems on it doesn't void the contract that you already had. So really the only way to actually do that would be to terminate your current contract and then redo a whole new one, which frankly, who wants to do all of that? Sometimes it's necessary, but not most of the time. So usually you can just cross it out and make a change. But these are the items under 4T, the most commonly amended items to the 2T. Purchase price is changed from X to X. All right. The additional earnest money, we're going to add additional earnest money now. Something happened and the seller's like, look, if you want to do that, I'm going to need more earnest money from you. All right. So if that's the case, then that's what we'll put there. And then, of course, if you do the additional earnest money, what the new additional earnest money date would be. If you're changing the building deposit, the due diligence fee, changing the due diligence fee amount, then due diligence period. That's used an awful lot. And we're changing it from today and adding a week to it. So the new date goes in there, right? Who's the escrow agent? So a lot of people forget about this. They say, oh, we were going to use Philip Price for our closing, so we gave him the earnest money, but now we're going to use Cawley Law Firm. Well, if that's the case and you're moving the earnest money, then you have to do an amendment. And you have to use 4T. All right, so make sure you're using this form for that. If you're changing the closing date, the settlement date, you click this here, you're changing it to this date, but it does give us this option. It's an option. You don't have to check the box, but if you do, just like it says here, it will give them to that date plus basically 4 days. So it's not giving them another 14 days past that date. It's really only just giving them those 4. All right, so you use that to extend the closing date. And then the expenses or your closing costs, buyer paid closing costs being paid by the seller, say that was from 0 and now it's being changed to $4,000. This is where you would do that. All right, so you do those and then buyer and seller signs them. Pretty simple, pretty simple. All right, and the last amendment form I'll go over today is on the agency agreements. Let's click over there, 710 agency agreement renewal. Click over there. Taking just a minute. Taking more than a minute. Okay. All right, here we go. All right, so 710, this is your agency renewal and amendment form. This is what you're going to use to change anything on listing agreement, buyer agency agreements. Okay. Now you notice in here there is a blank spot for you to write whatever you want in there. The reason that is okay is because this is between the listing agreement or buyer agency agreement and the client. So between the firm and the client. So that way we can legally write something, we can legally write some language or something that we could put into there. All right. So that's why there's a blank spot there. But make sure you check the right box, whether it's for 101 for listing agreement, 103 for land listing agreement, or 201 for buyer agency agreement. Basically, we don't do these other two with our firm. So it'd be one of those top 3 blanks. Now, I wish they could rename this a little bit, but it says dated. What they mean is the date of the contract, the execution date of the contract. And that's why it has an extra D in there instead of just date, it's dated. But sometimes people forget, they just put today's date in there, and that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for the date that that listing agreement was executed. Okay, so get the right date in there. It's between the client's name and the firm name, whatever was listed on the listing agreement, buyer agency agreement, that's what should be on here. The property address or MLS number if it's a listing. Buyer agency, just put NA in there is fine. Are we extending the agreement? That's the first block, extending the agreement. So the new one is extended to X date. If you're not extending it with this amendment, you can just do NA on that. Price shall be changed from blank to blank. So if you have a listing, every time you make a price change, say you go from 400 to 390, and then next week you go 390 to 385, each and every price change should be written in here. All right, and newly signed. Unless, the only unless there is if you had an agreement with them where you said, hey, we're going to change from 390 to 385 if we don't have a contract on this date, and then on this date we're going to do that. You could do several different amendments with dates on them and have them signed so they don't have to re-sign, keep signing a new form. that's perfectly fine too. Okay. So you have the price changes here, and then you have the other amendments. So anything else that's being changed in the listing agreement or buyer agency agreement would be listed there. All right, client sign, agent sign, and there you go. All right, so it's a quick review of agency. I'm sorry, of amendments and the terminations, but hope it was a good quick review for you to come back to and go back over those forms. But of course, if you got any other questions, just let me know. And hope you're having a good one. Talk to you later.